I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bibles or your devices to Deuteronomy chapter 14, the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 14, verse 22. We are in week 3 of a series called Contagious Generosity. It is a series about finances. It's like the elephant in the room when you talk about finances. Nobody likes to talk about finances. It somehow kind of makes us squirm and feel uncomfortable when we talk about the Bible and finances and our money. Before my dad was going to church, he'd always grumble. Every time I'd go to church, the pastor would always preach on finances. The first Sunday that my dad ever heard me preach. Sorry, Dad. Preaching on finances. So if you remember back in January when I took a week of vacation and I went back to help my dad, we ended up going to their church. And guess what he was preaching on? Finances. So I went home and said, Dad, every time I come to your church, you're always talking about finances. So I said, yeah, I could turn about fair play. But Deuteronomy chapter 14. Now, last week, we learned that the source of generosity, and in fact, the source of contagious generosity, it starts with God. And in fact, when we think about money, and if we really truly want to have a biblical worldview of money, it starts with God. Just like anything else when it comes to a biblical worldview, how we see the world and how we respond to the world, it must come through the lens of the Bible. And it must start with God. And we learned last week that God, in Genesis 1:1, that God in the beginning created everything. He created the heavens and the earth. And everything in the earth and on the earth and the galaxies and the stars. God created everything. He is the creator. We are the created. Okay? So the first thing is that God created everything. And the second thing that we learned was that God owns it all. God owns everything. He owns our houses. He owns our car. He owns our money. He owns our job. He even owns our health. He owns this body. He owns my mind, my heart, everything. He owns me. My children are not mine. Our children are the Lord's. So everything that we hold dear to our hearts really belongs to God. God created everything, and God owns everything. So what is our responsibility? Well, our responsibility is that we are stewards. That is, we manage God's creation. And amazingly, He has entrusted man with his creation. But there was something also that Paul was blown away by, that he was also entrusted with something else. And he was entrusted with the gospel. And you and I are entrusted not only with God's creation, but we are entrusted. We have been given the gospel, and so we are then to share it. With everyone that we have come in contact with. We are God's stewards. It's not our stuff, it's God's. And so we are therefore stewards of what God has given us. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, what we start to see here is this idea of tithing. As God begins to lay out for the Israelites how to relate to Him, there is something called the tithe that He lays out and wants them to obey. Verse 22, Deuteronomy 14. Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you would like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything else you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied. And so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. What God lays out here for God's people and for us is that the people of God are to give back to God. They are to give back to God. The first mention of a tithe in the Old Testament is you got to go all the way back to Abraham. If you remember, Abraham gave to Melchizedek a tenth of all his spoils after rescuing his nephew Lot. The Israelites were to give a tenth of their crops, their fruits, and even their herds. Now, if you remember back last summer, I did a series on Psalm 23. And if you remember, the shepherd carried a staff. And what that shepherd would do, and because that staff had other purposes, is that he would take that staff, and what he would do is that he would have the sheep go through the gate. And every 10th sheep, he would mark with his staff. And that 10th sheep was to be then given as a tithe. Well, every third year, the tithe remained local. The tithe was given to the poor. The tithe was given to the widow, the fatherless, even the priests. And the Levites also received it because they had no inheritance. Remember, the Lord was their inheritance. They were given no land. So the tithe that was given on behalf of the Israelites went to the Levites. The Levites were to give the Lord a tenth of what they received. So in essence, they gave a tenth of a tenth. And then every third year, that tithe remained local. So where did this idea, this notion of 10% or a tithe come about? Well, a tenth of a portion is also called a tithe. So when we use the word tithe, we're talking about a tenth. We're talking 10%. So in a sense, church lingo, when we talk about tithing, we give our tithes, we're talking about giving 10%. So when you hear tithe, think 10% or a tenth. Well, a tenth of a portion or tithe was common because most people counted in tens based upon their fingers, right? It's much easier to count with fingers than a tens. But nowhere does the New Testament require disciples to tithe in the sense of giving 10%. So what was then the purpose of the Old Testament tithe? Well, first, tithing taught the Israelites to revere the Lord. If you look with me in verse 23, eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. So one of the reasons for the tithe was to revere the Lord, in a sense, to respect him, to honor him as he should. The second reason for tithing was that tithing indicated devotion to God. In Malachi chapter 3, in verses 8 to 12, the Israelites were not giving as they should. In fact, withholding tithes and offerings was viewed as robbing God. Not because God missed it or it was somehow not his, but it had to do with the concept of our hearts and devotion. God could not care less how much they gave back. But by not giving back to God his due, it showed their lack of devotion. And so it was considered as robbing God. However, great prosperity was promised if they had obeyed. Jesus then, in the New Testament, refocused tithing to reflect inward attitudes. Jesus saw stewardship of finances as an indicator of spiritual trustworthiness and maturity. You see, that's how Jesus viewed finances and the stewardship of it. From the perspective of trustworthiness and maturity. You see, God has given us his stuff. God has given us his creation. And when we give it back to him, we respect him, we honor him. A number of years ago, when I was a wee little kid, I got into this habit. I'm glad my son is not here to hear me. But I got into this habit. I was playing with fire. Okay? So behind the garage, I would dig these holes with my father's shovel. And I'd get leaves or paper and, I'd create this fire. And so I was like burning everything. Well, one day, I'm behind the garage lighting this fire. And my dad comes out and he goes and yells, "Jeff, where are you?" Well, I took his shovel and I threw it into a bunch of pine trees. 2 days later, I came back and the shovel was gone. And so a week later, my dad wanted the shovel. And he knew that I was using it. So he asked me about it. Now, I knew that it was gone. Someone had taken it. And so I lied and said, "Oh, someone else had it." And we went down to the neighbor's house. They didn't have it. Well, of course, I knew that. Well, let's put it this way. The Board of Education was applied to the seat of understanding that day. And I learned to this day that because I disrespected my dad's stuff, I was disrespecting him as my father. Now, he didn't care whether I used his shovel. It was okay. But the fact that I was not using it properly and not respecting his stuff, I was disrespecting him. And in the same way, when we don't give back to God, we are in a sense disrespecting him. And in the same way, as we do give back to God, we honor him, we respect him, we revere him, and it shows our devotion to him. You see, when we give back to God, we acknowledge His authority in our lives. We give Him the respect that He is due. When we don't give back to God is when we disrespect Him. When we give back to God, we demonstrate our devotion to Him. Giving back to God is a spiritual issue. Money is a spiritual issue because it shows God what we are devoted to. And that's why giving, money, finances, possessions, it's a spiritual issue. It will show how devoted we are to the one who has blessed us with everything. Generosity, or the lack thereof, is an indicator of where we are at spiritually with God. When we don't give back to God, we are, in a sense, robbing God. And that is why generosity is a spiritual issue. It is a spiritual attitude. Well, Jesus was also a master of taking ordinary situations and turning them into teaching moments. And I'm going to ask you to turn over to Mark chapter 12. Mark 12. Mark 12, and I'm going to be beginning in verse 38 because it gives us a little bit of background as to what was going on to the situation where Jesus takes the disciples. In Mark chapter 12, verse 38, as he taught, he said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Jesus makes the point, and that when we give back to God, we need to give until it hurts. Give sacrificially. Give until it hurts. Give when there isn't anything left. Jesus warns his disciples about the pride of the teachers of the law. Now, Jesus loves the teachers of the law, okay? But what he was seeing here is that he was pointing out that the teachers of the law were filled with pride. And it was the pride that Jesus despised. You see, their pride was a pride of superiority. It was a pride that destroyed people. It was a pride that tore people down. And that is what Jesus condemned here. He wasn't condemning the teachers of the law per se. What he was condemning was their attitude, their pride. And he says that they will be punished most severely. Well, just after his comments, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were given. And the rich were giving large sums of money, and they were puffed up with pride. But the poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And the text says that it was just a few cents, a few pennies. And then Jesus declares that the widow put in far more into the treasury than all the rest. Well, if you want to look at it monetarily, no, that wasn't correct. In fact, the rich were actually monetarily in value putting in much, much, much more than this poor widow. So why would Jesus say that this poor widow put in far more? Because she gave out of her poverty. She gave all that she had to live on. You see, Jesus is making a distinction here that it is not about the quantity, but it is about the quality of the the heart. You see, Jesus is making a point here that it's about attitude. And this poor widow had the right attitude when it came to giving. By way of contrast, Jesus points out that the true disciple is the one who has the right attitude about giving, has the right attitude when it comes to generosity. You see, God is pleased when we give out of our poverty. It's the same principle when it comes to love. It's easy to love people who love and agree with us, right? I mean, it's pretty easy. But what about the people that we don't like? Is it easy to love them? You see, there is no true sacrifice loving those who love us. But when we love those that don't like us, well, that's another matter. And so giving out of our wealth, you see, is easy. There's no true sacrifice in giving out of our wealth. When we have plenty, yeah, we're ready to give it up. When we have plenty, when there's a surplus, yeah, we're ready. We got, let's just give it away. What about when we don't have anything? Or we have very little? Are we willing to part with that? And that's why God is pleased when we give out of our poverty. Giving when we have very little is true sacrifice. And that is why generosity is about attitude. You see, giving until it hurts exposes our true attitude when it comes to money, when it comes to finances. Because then we are forced with a decision now. Do we give or don't give? It also exposes our true devotion to God. Do we give until it hurts? Matthew West wrote a song called My Own Little World. The verses are up there. The first two stanzas of his song are up there, and I just wanted to read them. He says, "In my own little world, it hardly ever rains. I never gone hungry or always felt safe. I got some money in my pocket, shoes on my feet. In my own little world, population, me. I try to stay awake till the Sunday morning church. I throw a 20 in the plate, but I never give until it hurts. And I turn off the news when I don't like what I see. Yeah, it's easy to do when it's population, me." It's convicting. Do we really give when it hurts? Or are we only giving and feel good when we have plenty? And that's why Jesus said, this woman gave far greater because she gave what she didn't have. And when we do that, God smiles. God's pleased. You see, we are to give back to God. We're also to give until it hurts. In other words, give sacrificially. And then finally, when it comes to giving back to God, we need to be intentional when giving back to Him. Be intentional. Intentional giving means carefully considering the following when giving back to God. First, when we give back to God, we need to make giving back to Him a priority in our life. We need to make it a priority. To give back to God must be a priority in our life. Prayerfully ask the Lord how much He wants you to give each week. And we went over that 2 weeks ago. First, in your heart, determine how much the Lord wants you to give each week. And then make it a priority to give that amount each week. Make it the first thing that you do after receiving your paycheck. When you receive your paycheck, whenever it is, write out that check to the Lord to give it back to Him. When you get that paycheck, go to your mobile app and make your donation online right then and there. Or text it. Or go to our website. Make giving back to God a priority in your life. Because you know what happens when we don't? This is what happens. We get our paycheck. And we got all kinds of bills to pay. And we pay all our bills. And then we want pizza Friday night. So we get pizza. And then something else happens on Saturday. And so we go through our whole paycheck. And then Sunday rolls around. I don't have anything in my checkbook. So I dig into my pocket and I got a few bucks, a couple coins, and I toss it into the plate. If we make giving back God a priority, then that will be the first thing that we do. It shows our devotion to Him. It shows that we recognize that He has blessed us in every way. Number 2, service is not giving. Your area of service to the church is not a replacement for your weekly offering. You see, the church needs to fulfill its financial obligations. Now, if we trade service for giving, and half the church does that, we will not be able to financially sustain ourselves. Because the church needs income to pay the bills. The lights, the air conditioning that we're going to be able to enjoy next month, the salaries that we pay, the missionaries that we pay out, all come from the general fund. And if there isn't money coming into that general fund, then we don't have the monies to pay and fulfill our financial obligations. So therefore, we need to determine what it is that we in our heart will give. We give each week. Now our service to the church, or an area of service, is based upon the spiritual gifts in which the Holy Spirit has given us at the day of salvation. And the purpose of service and the purpose of our spiritual gifts is so that the body together will grow and be edified and be built up and grow. So our service to the church is different, and it serves a different role than our giving to the church. And so therefore, service is not giving. Third, special giving is above and beyond weekly giving. Special giving, such as to the camp scholarship, or to the Awana scholarship, or to the gym remodel, or to any other designated fund should be above and beyond what we are to give each week, as we have determined by the Lord. It should be above and beyond. This also applies to giving to other ministries outside of the local church. This would include YFC. This would include the Salvation Army. This would include Gratiot County Pregnancy Services, or even radio ministries or TV ministries. You see, you are to give each week, and then if you want to give something more, then that's above and beyond what you've determined in the Lord your heart to give. In fact, I listen to many radio programs. And if you notice that when they ask for the money at the end of the program, they want your contribution, right? And most will say that you are to give to your local church first. And if the Lord leads you to give a contribution to that ministry, they would be glad to receive it. But I like the fact that they stress that they need to be giving to the local church first. So special giving is above and beyond our weekly giving. Fourth, give with no strings attached. If you're ever in a position where you're going to donate an item, or even give, let's say, a large sum of money, then give it freely. Give it with the idea that you're not going to take it back. Now, when you do that, you have to assume a couple things. Number one, you have to assume that it may not be given and used for that very purpose that you want it to be used for. So when you give something, whatever it is, okay, and you give it to the church, you have to understand that it may be used for something different than what you intended. And it also might be banged up or even broken, okay? And you have to be okay with that. So when you give to the church, give with no strings attached. And similar to point number 2, donating an item to the church, whatever it is, should never replace your weekly giving. And the reason is that if you're not giving back to God what you have determined in your heart, and you're using that donation, whatever it is, to replace your weekly giving, then in a sense you're robbing God. You're replacing that donation with your weekly giving. You see, that donation should be above and beyond what you give each week. Now, if we truly believe that God created everything and that God owns everything, then giving cheerfully with no strings attached should be easy. But I've been in enough churches to know that sometimes when things are given, there are strings attached. And that makes it very difficult because it's a question of motive. Why are you giving that, and for what reason? When you give it freely. It says, this is the Lord's. Remember, it goes back to the fact that God owns it all, right? I remember one day we had an air hockey table in our house at Jenison, and we sold the house, and we were having a garage sale to move up here, and we were talking about donating this air hockey table, and I remember distinctly a discussion we had, and it came up that if we are to donate it to a church, we have to realize that it's going to get broken. It's going to get beat up. And we need to be okay with that. Give with no strings attached. Giving it all. Giving it until it hurts can be a real challenge. I came across a story almost 20 years ago. And the reason why I know about this story that came about 20 years ago is because it's about a resort in the Gatlinburg area. It's called Hidden Mountain Resorts. And the reason why I know of this is because Dawn and I spent our honeymoon there. And these are little cabins tucked into the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. And it was gorgeous. And I wanted to share with you their story. In the spring of 1981, in the midst of a small recession, which gripped the country, my wife Brenda and I were looking for a way to make ends meet. Home building had come to a standstill, and with 3 children, ages 3, 4, and 5, we were looking for an alternative means of earning a living. We knew the 1982 World's Fair would be coming to Knoxville in just a little over a year. There was talk of a room shortage in the area during the fair. Well, this got us thinking about the possibility of renting cabins to the crowds who were to come. Gatlinburg had Ski Mountain, which rented chalets to the skiers and summer guests who visited the national park. We thought the idea of log cabins in a rustic mountain setting just might appeal to a lot of people. Armed with this dream and little else, we bought a few lots in a development that Brenda's dad had created called Hidden Mountain. In October 1981, Hidden Mountain Chalet and Log Cabin Rentals opened with 7 units and a 16 by 20 foot office on a gravel road. With help from a few motels in the area, we managed to take in $1,000 per unit that first October. We were extremely encouraged by our modest success and closed our office for the winter to begin building more units to get ready for the World's Fair traffic the following summer. Some of our family members got involved in the project, and we reopened in May of 1982 with about 25 units and 4 new partners. Although the World's Fair did not live up to the expectations of area businesses, Hidden Mountain was well received by the people who did come and stay with us. While the area as a whole did not do well during this time, we still felt encouraged about the possibilities of the Hidden Mountain idea. After some good old-fashioned horse trading with our partners, Brenda and I once again wound up the sole owners of our dream development. Our dream soon became a nightmare as we realized sometime in late August that the fair would end in October, and so would our income. We personally owned about 9 homes, which we had to pay for over the winter with no income. It was during this very bleak time that a remarkable thing happened to us. God began to teach us about tithing. We were both Christians and attended church regularly, but we had never been tithers. We just couldn't afford it. We knew God understood. So why was he asking of us now? We were in extreme circumstances, and surely he, being God, knew that. But he wouldn't leave us alone. We had all of these homes, plus our residence in Sevierville, and 3 children to feed with no source of income. Why couldn't he see that? We tried every argument, but to no avail. He wasn't going away with this idea. His convicting spirit was overwhelming. A former customer of ours who owed us some money had paid us, and God wanted the money, and he wanted all of it. We knew that we should trust him, trust his promises. But when you're looking bankruptcy right in the face, it sure makes it difficult. Finally, we gave in. We gave him the money, asking him to forgive us. We gave it cheerfully and without regret, and we asked for nothing in return. For the first time in our lives, we put our total trust in Him. Then you wouldn't believe what happened next. We had not intended to sell the rental units, but that seemed like the only way to survive the winter. But we had no customers and didn't know where to look for any potential buyers. But God was true to His promises. Our rental customers began to ask about the possibility of buying a unit. And before Christmas, we sold every rental unit we had. Guess who got the first 10% of the profit? We must remember that giving back to God is for our benefit, not for His. Give back to Him. Give it till it hurts. For we are His stewards to do with what He has blessed us with. Would you pray with me? Father, we come before you today. We thank you again for all of the blessings that you have given us to enjoy. Father, I pray that you would help us and stir in our hearts this idea of generosity. Help us to be a more generous people, more generous with our money, more generous with our possessions, more generous with our time. Father, I pray that you would stir our hearts to see that what you have given us, what the paychecks that we give it back to you to honor you, to show our true devotion and love for you. Lord, thank you for giving us your word to teach us these concepts. For the glory and praise of Jesus Christ. Amen.